On the morning of March 12, 2023, the suburban community of Springville woke up to an unsettling discovery that would leave its residents shaken for months to come. Nestled in the heart of the peaceful town was an abandoned warehouse, long forgotten and shrouded in eerie whispers of past misdeeds. It was here, amidst the decaying walls and broken windows, that a gruesome scene was uncovered. A 16-year-old girl, Emily Turner, was found unconscious, blood staining her clothes and face, while just a few feet away lay the lifeless body of her classmate, Jake Williams. The tragic tableau sent shockwaves through the town, unraveling the facade of tranquility that had long defined the community. Springville was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. Its tree-lined streets, meticulously kept lawns, and friendly neighbors painted a picture of idyllic small-town life. Crime was rare, and when it did occur, it was usually something minor, a stolen bicycle or a prank gone too far. The discovery at the warehouse was unlike anything the town had ever seen. Parents held their children closer, locking doors and casting suspicious glances at anyone who didn't belong. For a place where normalcy was the norm, this crime felt like an invasion, a crack in the community's carefully curated armor. The warehouse itself was a relic of another era. Decades ago, it had been a bustling hub for local businesses. A place where workers clocked in and out under the hum of machinery. But time had not been kind to the building. Its doors were padlocked, its windows boarded up, and its once sturdy walls now bore the scars of neglect and graffiti. For the younger residents of Springville, the warehouse had taken on an almost mythical status. It was a place of dares and whispered stories, where the bravest among them would venture on moonlit nights to prove their courage. That night, however, it wasn't a dare that had brought Emily and Jake to the warehouse. The police were called early that morning when a jogger passing by noticed something amiss. The sight of a broken window, the faint glint of something metallic, a knife, as it would later be identified, and the eerie silence surrounding the area prompted the jogger to dial 911. Officers arrived within minutes, and what they found inside was far worse than they had imagined. Emily was lying near the center of the warehouse, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Blood trickled from a deep wound on her temple, staining the cracked concrete beneath her. Jake's body was sprawled just a few feet away, motionless and surrounded by a dark, drying pool of blood. His injuries were severe, with a deep laceration to his abdomen that suggested a violent struggle. The scene was chaotic, with overturned crates, shards of broken glass, and faint smudges of blood leading toward the exit. It was clear that whatever had transpired here had been sudden, intense, and horrifying. The police quickly cordoned off the area, their flashing lights casting an unsettling glow against the warehouse's grimy walls. Forensics teams moved with practiced precision, cataloging evidence and photographing every detail of the crime scene. A bloodied metal rod was discovered near Emily's body, and initial analysis suggested it could have been the weapon used during the altercation. The atmosphere was thick with tension as officers exchanged grim glances, their minds racing with questions. What had brought these teenagers to this desolate place? What had gone so horribly wrong? Emily was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize her. She had suffered a severe concussion and multiple bruises across her arms and torso, consistent with defensive wounds. Jake, however, was beyond saving. The medical examiner would later determine that he had died from a combination of blood loss and internal injuries. His death was not instantaneous. He had likely succumbed to his wounds over the course of several agonizing minutes. News of the incident spread like wildfire through Springville. Within hours, the warehouse became a focal point for reporters, curious onlookers, and grieving classmates. Social media erupted with speculation, each post more sensational than the last. Some claimed it was a gang initiation gone wrong, while others suggested a secret romance turned deadly. The truth, however, was far more complicated, rooted in the tangled web of emotions, pressures, and decisions that defined the lives of these two teenagers. Emily Turner was not just another face in the crowd. A junior at Springville High, she was the kind of student teachers loved and classmates admired. With her straight-A grades, involvement in student council, and volunteer work at the local animal shelter, Emily seemed destined for greatness. Yet, beneath her polished exterior, she was battling demons few could see. The pressure to excel, to be perfect, weighed heavily on her, leaving little room for mistakes or self-discovery. Jake Williams was her opposite in many ways. A senior with a reputation for trouble, he was the kind of boy parents warned their daughters about. Jake had a rebellious streak, a defiant charm that drew people to him even as it pushed authority figures away. He was known for skipping classes, throwing wild parties, and flirting with danger. Yet, those who knew him well spoke of a different Jake, a boy who carried the weight of his own struggles, who longed for acceptance but didn't know how to find it. The two had crossed paths at school, their unlikely friendship forming during a group project for English class. Emily had been assigned as Jake's partner, much to her dismay. She saw him as a distraction, a threat to her carefully maintained GPA. But as they spent time together, working on late-night presentations and sharing stories over coffee, Emily began to see a side of Jake that surprised her. He was witty, insightful, and surprisingly vulnerable. For Jake, Emily represented a stability he'd never known, a glimpse into a world where things made sense. Their bond deepened over the months, and though they came from different worlds, they found solace in each other. Emily, who had always followed the rules, felt a thrilling sense of freedom in Jake's company. Jake, in turn, found a confidant in Emily, someone who didn't judge him for his flaws. But their friendship was far from simple. It was fraught with misunderstandings, unspoken feelings, and the unrelenting pressure of their individual lives. As investigators pieced together the events leading up to that fateful night, a clearer picture began to emerge. Text messages between Emily and Jake, recovered from their phones, revealed plans to meet at the warehouse. Emily's messages were hesitant, laced with concern, while Jake's replies were cryptic and insistent. "You have to trust me," one message read. "This is the only way." What Jake had meant by those words remained a mystery, but their tone hinted at desperation. The discovery of a small backpack near Jake's body added another layer of intrigue. Inside were items that seemed out of place: a roll of duct tape, a flashlight, and a notebook filled with sketches and fragmented thoughts. The notebook's contents were troubling, hinting at a mind in turmoil. Phrases like "no way out" and "it ends here" suggested Jake had been grappling with something far deeper than anyone had realized. As the sun set over Springville that evening, the warehouse stood silent once more, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. For the Turner and Williams families, life would never be the same. For the rest of the community, the events of that day were a stark wake-up call, a painful reminder that even in the most picturesque towns, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface. The questions surrounding Emily and Jake's final moments would linger for weeks to come, driving an investigation that would uncover secrets no one was prepared to face. Emily Turner's life seemed picture-perfect to anyone who observed it from the outside. With her warm smile, neatly styled blonde hair, and straight posture, she embodied the image of a young woman destined for greatness. Teachers at Springville High praised her as an ideal student, punctual, attentive, and consistently achieving top grades. Her parents, Susan and Michael Turner, proudly displayed her certificates of excellence on the walls of their meticulously maintained suburban home. Emily's reputation was spotless, and the expectations placed on her shoulders were immense, but behind closed doors, the cracks in Emily's seemingly flawless life were beginning to show. The Turner household was a polished exterior masking an undercurrent of relentless pressure. Susan, a former attorney turned homemaker, had devoted herself to ensuring Emily's success. She scheduled every hour of Emily's day with military precision: school, extracurricular activities, private tutoring, and community service. Michael, a marketing executive, often reminded Emily of the sacrifices the family made to provide her with every opportunity. Failure, in their eyes, was not an option, Emily had learned to internalize these expectations, wearing her perfectionism like a badge of honor. She excelled at everything she attempted, but the cost was mounting. Her days were a blur of tasks and obligations, leaving little room for rest or self-reflection. Sleep was often sacrificed for studying. And moments of joy were overshadowed by the looming specter of her parents' disapproval. The pressure to maintain her pristine image was suffocating, but Emily couldn't bring herself to admit it, not to her parents, her teachers, or even her closest friends. Jake Williams lived in a world that couldn't have been more different from Emily's. The Williams family had always struggled to make ends meet. Jake's father, Dan, was a mechanic who worked long hours at the local repair shop, while his mother, Linda, juggled multiple part-time jobs to help pay the bills. Their modest home was cluttered and chaotic, a stark contrast to the Turners' pristine abode. Unlike Emily, Jake had grown up with the understanding that life was messy and unpredictable. Jake's reputation at Springville High was as infamous as Emily's was celebrated. Teachers regarded him as a troublemaker, a slacker who coasted through classes with minimal effort. He was the boy who skipped school to hang out at the skate park. The one who'd show up late with a cocky grin and a devil-may-care attitude. Yet, there was a magnetism about Jake that made him hard to ignore. He was charming in a rebellious sort of way, his sharp wit and easygoing demeanor drawing others to him like moths to a flame, but Jake's carefree facade was as much a mask as Emily's perfectionism. Beneath his bravado lay a deep sense of frustration and insecurity. Jake felt trapped in a life where opportunities were scarce and expectations were low. He longed for something more, a chance to prove himself, to escape the shadow of his family's struggles. But without the resources or support that Emily took for granted, he often resorted to risky and impulsive behavior in search of validation. The paths of these two teenagers, so different yet so alike in their yearning for something beyond their reach, converged during their junior year. It started with a group project for English class. Emily, ever the diligent student, was assigned to work with Jake, whose reputation as a slacker made him an unwelcome partner. At first, Emily bristled at the idea of working with someone she perceived as unserious and unreliable. Jake, for his part, saw Emily as the epitome of everything he resented about the system: privileged, polished, and painfully perfect. Despite their initial misgivings, the project forced them to spend time together, and gradually, their guarded exteriors began to crack. Emily was surprised to find that Jake was more insightful than she had given him credit for. He had a sharp mind and a creative streak that emerged when he let his guard down. Jake, in turn, was struck by Emily's vulnerability. Beneath her composed demeanor was someone just as uncertain and flawed as he was, someone who struggled to reconcile who she was with who she was expected to be. Their partnership extended beyond the confines of the classroom. Late-night study sessions at the library turned into long conversations about their hopes and fears. Jake introduced Emily to his favorite music, a mix of indie rock and punk that resonated with her in ways she didn't expect. Emily, in turn, helped Jake organize his thoughts and channel his energy into their project. Together, they found a balance that neither had experienced before, a rare sense of understanding that transcended their differences. As their friendship deepened, it began to draw attention. Emily's friends were puzzled by her newfound connection with Jake, while Jake's circle of acquaintances teased him about spending time with a goody two-shoes. The whispers and raised eyebrows only served to strengthen their bond. For Emily, Jake was a breath of fresh air, someone who didn't judge her by her achievements or demand perfection. For Jake, Emily was a stabilizing force, someone who believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. Yet, their friendship was not without its challenges. Emily's parents disapproved of her spending time with Jake, whom they viewed as a bad influence. Susan Turner, in particular, was vocal about her concerns, warning Emily that associating with someone like Jake could jeopardize her future. Emily, torn between her parents' expectations and her desire to maintain her friendship with Jake, began to feel the strain of living a double life. She kept their meetings a secret, sneaking out after finishing her homework to meet Jake at the local diner or the skate park. Jake, too, faced scrutiny from his family and friends. His parents, though less judgmental than Emily's, worried about his growing attachment to someone from a different world. They feared that Emily's influence might change him in ways they didn't understand. Jake's friends, meanwhile, were quick to point out the improbability of their friendship lasting, teasing him about being domesticated by the school's golden girl. Despite the obstacles, Emily and Jake found solace in each other. Their connection was a refuge from the pressures and expectations that weighed on them. But the very differences that drew them together also set the stage for the events that would ultimately tear them apart. As Emily and Jake navigated the complexities of their friendship, they were unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon, a storm that would test their bond in ways neither of them could have anticipated. As the months passed, Emily Turner and Jake Williams' friendship began to shift into something far more complicated. Their initial bond, rooted in mutual understanding and a shared sense of loneliness, deepened in unexpected ways. The secret nature of their connection added an air of excitement but also a growing sense of danger. What had started as late-night conversations and stolen moments in quiet corners evolved into a relationship that blurred the boundaries between friendship and something more. Emily, for the first time in her life, felt a sense of liberation. Jake's presence was a reprieve from the relentless pressures of her meticulously scheduled life. With him, she didn't have to perform or strive for perfection. She could simply exist, unburdened by expectations. Jake introduced her to parts of the world she'd never experienced: nights spent stargazing from the hood of his battered car, clandestine trips to a nearby city for underground music shows, and even the thrill of sneaking into places they weren't supposed to be. These moments, though fleeting, felt more real to Emily than anything she'd known before. Jake, too, found himself transformed by their relationship. Emily's unwavering belief in his potential began to chip away at the cynicism he'd carried for years. For the first time, he considered the possibility of a future that didn't involve aimlessly drifting through life. Emily's influence pushed him to try harder in school, to think about what he wanted beyond the next thrill. Yet, Jake's past habits and impulsive nature often clashed with the version of himself he aspired to become. Their bond, however, was not without its challenges. Emily's parents grew increasingly suspicious of her late nights and unexplained absences. Susan Turner, ever the vigilant mother, began to notice small changes in her daughter: the way Emily's once pristine school planner now contained crossed-out appointments, her distracted demeanor at family dinners, and the occasional slip of a smile when she thought no one was watching. It didn't take long for Susan to connect the dots, and her disapproval of Jake intensified. "Emily, I need to talk to you," Susan said one evening, her voice edged with concern. "Is there something going on with you and that boy, Jake?" Emily froze, her fork hovering mid-air over her plate. "We're just friends, Mom. It's nothing serious." "Friends don't make you lie to your family," Susan shot back. "You're risking everything for this. This boy who doesn't have your best interests at heart." The argument escalated, with Emily defending Jake and Susan insisting that he was a bad influence. That night, Emily retreated to her room, her emotions a swirling storm of anger and guilt. She texted Jake, her fingers trembling as she typed, "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." Jake's reply was swift: "You don't have to do it alone. Let's get out of here for a while. Just you and me." The idea of escaping Springville, even temporarily, was tempting. But Emily knew it was impossible. The weight of her responsibilities and the expectations placed on her were inescapable, no matter how far she ran. Still, the thought lingered in the back of her mind, a tiny spark of rebellion waiting for the right moment to ignite. Meanwhile, Jake's life was spiraling in a different direction. His home environment, already strained, grew more volatile as his parents' financial struggles deepened. Arguments erupted almost nightly, and Jake often found himself caught in the crossfire. To cope, he began spending more time away from home, wandering the streets or hanging out with a rougher crowd. It was during one of these nights that Jake's path took a darker turn. A friend of Jake's, Kyle, had recently gotten involved with a local group known for petty thefts and vandalism. Kyle convinced Jake to join them on a harmless adventure, breaking into the old warehouse on the edge of town. The building, long abandoned, was rumored to hold forgotten treasures from its days as a manufacturing hub. Jake, desperate for distraction and a sense of belonging, reluctantly agreed. The warehouse was everything the rumors promised: dark, eerie, and filled with the remnants of a bygone era. Rusting machinery, stacks of dusty crates, and graffiti-covered walls created an atmosphere that was equal parts thrilling and unsettling. The group moved through the space with flashlights, their laughter echoing in the cavernous interior. But as they searched for anything of value, Jake's thoughts kept drifting back to Emily. He pulled out his phone and texted her, "You'd love this place. It's wild." Emily's reply came minutes later, "Where are you?" The moment Jake told her, Emily knew she shouldn't go. She had an exam to study for, a curfew to meet, and parents who would undoubtedly notice her absence. But something about Jake's message stirred a sense of curiosity and defiance within her. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her jacket and slipped out the window, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. When Emily arrived at the warehouse, the group had already begun to disperse. Kyle and the others had grown bored and left, leaving Jake alone to explore. He greeted Emily with a wide grin, the light of his flashlight catching the sparkle in her eyes. "I can't believe you actually came," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and admiration. "I'm not sure I can believe it either," Emily admitted, glancing around the dimly lit space. "This place is something else." For the next hour, they wandered through the warehouse together, their laughter filling the empty halls. Jake showed Emily the sketches and notes he'd found in an old ledger, and Emily marveled at the faded murals painted on the walls. It was a rare moment of freedom, a brief escape from the pressures of their everyday lives. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The building's shadows grew longer, and the air seemed heavier. Jake's demeanor changed, his movements more restless and his expression clouded with something Emily couldn't quite place. When she asked if everything was okay, he shrugged it off, but the tension between them was palpable. Unbeknownst to Emily, Jake had found something earlier that evening, something he hadn't shared with her or anyone else. Hidden beneath a pile of debris was a small, locked metal box. Jake had slipped it into his backpack, intending to open it later, but the discovery had unsettled him. It wasn't just the box itself, but the implications of what might be inside. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled onto something far bigger than a forgotten relic. As they prepared to leave, Jake's phone buzzed with a series of messages from Kyle. The texts were cryptic but urgent, referencing unfinished business and keeping quiet. Jake's face darkened as he read them, and Emily couldn't help but notice his sudden shift in mood. When she pressed him for answers, Jake hesitated before muttering, "It's nothing. Don't worry about it." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The night of March 11, 2023, began like so many others for Emily Turner. She had spent the afternoon studying for an upcoming exam, her textbook open on the desk and highlighters scattered around her room. Yet, despite her efforts to focus, her thoughts kept wandering back to Jake and the cryptic text he had sent earlier that evening. "You have to see this place. Meet me at the warehouse." The message stirred equal parts curiosity and trepidation within her. Emily knew she shouldn't go. Her parents were downstairs watching television, and her mother had already reminded her of the importance of staying focused. But Jake's words lingered in her mind, and the monotony of her carefully structured life pushed her to make a decision she would later regret. Slipping out of her bedroom window, she climbed down the trellis and disappeared into the cool night air. The streets of Springville were eerily quiet as Emily made her way toward the outskirts of town. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a shadowy silhouette against the moonlit sky. When she arrived, the building seemed even more foreboding than she had imagined. Its rusted exterior and broken windows exuded a sense of decay, and the faint sound of creaking metal carried through the wind. Jake was waiting for her near the entrance, a flashlight in hand and a mischievous grin on his face. "Took you long enough," he teased, but there was an edge to his voice that Emily couldn't ignore. "This place is creepy," she replied, hugging her jacket tightly around her. "Why did you want me to come here?" "You'll see," Jake said cryptically, leading her inside. The air inside the warehouse was damp and heavy, and the faint smell of rust and mildew filled her nostrils. Emily followed Jake through the maze of corridors, her footsteps echoing against the concrete floors. Every shadow seemed to shift, and every sound made her heart race. After a few minutes, Jake stopped in front of a pile of debris near the back of the building. He knelt down and pulled a small metal box from his backpack. "I found this earlier," he said, holding it up for Emily to see. The box was old and tarnished, its surface etched with strange symbols that sent a shiver down her spine. "What's inside?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake shook his head. "I haven't opened it yet. I wanted to wait for you." They sat together on the cold floor as Jake pried the box open with a pocketknife. Inside, they found a collection of old photographs, faded letters, and a small, intricately carved dagger. The items seemed out of place, as though they belonged to a different era. Emily picked up one of the photographs, her brow furrowing as she studied the image of a group of men standing in front of the warehouse. "This is weird," she muttered, handing the photograph to Jake. "Why would someone leave this here?" Before Jake could respond, a loud crash echoed through the building, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as she turned toward the source of the noise. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake stood up, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Probably just the wind," he said, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. "Stay here. I'll go check it out." "No way," Emily said, grabbing his arm. "I'm coming with you." Reluctantly, Jake nodded, and together they made their way toward the noise. The warehouse seemed even more menacing now, its shadows deeper and its sound sharper. As they turned a corner, they saw a group of figures standing near the entrance, their faces obscured by the dim light. One of them was holding a crowbar, and another had a flashlight similar to Jake's. "Who are you?" Jake called out, his voice steadied despite the fear in his eyes. The figures turned toward them, and the tension in the air became palpable. "You shouldn't be here," one of them said, his voice low and menacing. "This isn't your business." Jake stepped forward, shielding Emily with his body. "We're not looking for trouble. We just found this place and wanted to check it out." The man with the crowbar took a step closer, raising the weapon threateningly. "Then you should leave. Now." Emily's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. She clutched Jake's arm, her nails digging into his jacket. "Jake, let's go," she urged, her voice shaking. Before Jake could respond, one of the men lunged forward, grabbing the metal box from Jake's hands. Jake reacted instinctively, pulling Emily behind him and swinging his flashlight at the attacker. The beam connected with a dull thud, and the man stumbled backward, cursing loudly. Chaos erupted. The group of strangers advanced on them, and Jake fought back with everything he had. Emily, frozen in fear, watched as the confrontation escalated. The sound of fists meeting flesh, the clatter of falling objects, and the shouts of anger filled the warehouse, creating a cacophony of violence. At some point, Emily snapped out of her paralysis and grabbed a nearby metal rod. She swung it wildly, striking one of the attackers and giving Jake a chance to break free. "Run!" he shouted, pulling her toward the exit. They sprinted through the labyrinth of corridors, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Emily's legs burned with exertion, and her vision blurred with tears, but she pushed herself to keep going. The exit was in sight when she tripped over a piece of debris and fell hard onto the concrete floor. Emily! Jake yelled, turning back to help her. He reached for her hand, but before he could pull her to her feet, one of the attackers caught up to them. The man swung his crowbar, and Jake raised his arm to block the blow. The impact sent him crashing to the ground, his flashlight skittering across the floor. Emily screamed as the man loomed over Jake, ready to strike again. Desperation took over, and she grabbed the metal rod once more, swinging it with all her strength. The man cried out and staggered backward, giving Emily enough time to help Jake to his feet. Together, they stumbled out of the warehouse and into the night, their hearts pounding as they fled into the safety of the surrounding woods. Behind them, the attackers didn't follow, their angry shouts fading into the distance. But the damage had been done. Emily and Jake were battered and bruised, their clothes torn and their spirits shattered. When they finally stopped running, Jake collapsed against a tree, clutching his side. Emily knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she inspected his injuries. "We need to get help," she said, her voice cracking. "Not yet," Jake replied, his eyes dark with a mix of pain and fear. "We can't go to the cops. Not until we figure out what's going on." Emily stared at him, her mind racing with questions and doubts. The night had turned into a nightmare, and the consequences of their choices were only beginning to unfold. The sun was beginning to rise over Springville as Emily and Jake emerged from the woods, exhausted and shaken. The events of the night replayed in Emily's mind like a broken record. Every shadow seemed to move, every distant sound felt like the echo of footsteps chasing them. They had made it out of the warehouse, but the danger was far from over. "We can't stay out here," Emily whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "We need to find somewhere safe." Jake nodded, wincing as he clutched his side. "My place," he said, his voice strained. "We can figure things out there." Emily hesitated. Jake's home wasn't exactly a sanctuary. His parents were likely still asleep, and even if they weren't, she doubted they'd welcome her presence, especially if they knew what had just happened. But there wasn't much of a choice. The warehouse attackers could still be looking for them, and the thought of returning to her own house, with her parents' questions and accusations, was unbearable. They arrived at Jake's house just as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon. The small, cluttered living room smelled faintly of engine oil and stale coffee. Jake's father was snoring loudly on the couch, an empty beer can clutched in one hand. Jake motioned for Emily to follow him upstairs, his movements slow and pained. Once inside his room, he collapsed onto the bed, his face pale and drawn. Emily rummaged through his backpack, pulling out the metal box they had retrieved from the warehouse. Its contents lay scattered across Jake's desk, the photographs, the letters, and the small dagger. She couldn't shake the feeling that these items were the key to understanding what had happened that night. "We need to look through this," she said, her voice trembling. "There has to be something here that explains why those people were at the warehouse." Jake groaned but nodded. "Start with the letters," he said. "Maybe there's a clue." Emily unfolded one of the faded letters, her eyes scanning the shaky handwriting. The language was formal and archaic, and it took her a moment to make sense of the words. As she read, a chill ran down her spine. "To whomever finds this, know that this place holds more than memories. What we have hidden here must never fall into the wrong hands. It is a burden, a responsibility, and a curse." She looked up at Jake, her hands trembling. "This isn't just some random box," she said. "Whoever left this behind knew it was dangerous." Jake's expression darkened. "Dangerous enough for those guys to attack us over it." He picked up the small dagger, turning it over in his hands. The blade was dull, but the intricate carvings on the handle suggested it was more than just a weapon. "This thing. It's not normal." The photographs offered more questions than answers. One image showed a group of men standing in front of the warehouse, their faces stern and shadowed. Another depicted a meeting in what looked like an old, ornate office. In the corner of one photograph, Emily noticed a faint marking, the same symbol etched into the metal box. It's a seal, Jake said, leaning over to examine it. I've seen it before. Emily's heart raced. Where? Jake hesitated. Kyle showed me something a few weeks ago. He had a notebook with this symbol on it. Said it was connected to some secret group or whatever. I didn't think much of it at the time. Emily's mind spun as she pieced together the fragments of information. So Kyle knew about this? About the box? Jake's jaw tightened. I think so. And if those guys at the warehouse were after it, they probably know him too. The realization hit them both like a freight train. Kyle wasn't just a friend who had dragged Jake into a harmless adventure, he was a key player in whatever was happening. And if the attackers were connected to Kyle, it meant they weren't safe. We have to talk to him, Emily said firmly. He might know more about what's going on. Jake shook his head. You don't understand. If Kyle's involved in this, he's not going to help us. He'll just try to cover his own ass. Then we'll make him help us, Emily replied, her voice tinged with determination. We can't do this alone, Jake. We need answers. Reluctantly, Jake agreed, and they devised a plan to confront Kyle later that day. But as the hours passed, the weight of the night's events began to take its toll. Emily dozed off in a chair by the window, the morning sunlight casting long shadows across the room. Jake sat silently at his desk, his fingers tracing the edges of the photographs and letters. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were in over their heads. When Emily woke, the room was bathed in the golden glow of late afternoon. Jake had barely moved, his eyes fixed on the dagger resting on the desk. We should go, she said, her voice soft but insistent. Jake nodded, slipping the metal box and its contents back into his backpack. They left the house quietly, avoiding his parents, and made their way to Kyle's usual hangout spot, an abandoned lot behind the local gas station. Kyle was there, as they had expected, leaning against the hood of his car and smoking a cigarette. When he saw them approach, his expression shifted from casual indifference to guarded suspicion. What do you want? He asked, his tone sharp. Jake stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. We need to talk. About the warehouse. About the box. Kyle's eyes narrowed. I don't know what you're talking about. Emily stepped beside Jake, her gaze unwavering. Don't lie to us, Kyle. We know you're involved. We just want to know what's going on. For a moment, Kyle said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he crushed his cigarette under his heel. You two have no idea what you've gotten yourselves into, he said, his voice low. But if you really want to know the truth, you're not going to like it. Kyle's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, thick with foreboding. Emily and Jake exchanged a glance, their unease mirrored in each other's expressions. Whatever Kyle was about to reveal, they knew it would change everything. Start talking, Jake said, his voice steady but tinged with impatience. What do you know about the box? And who were those guys at the warehouse? Kyle sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. You two really messed up, he muttered. That box isn't just some random junk someone left behind. It belongs to a group called the Wardens. The Wardens? Emily repeated, frowning. Who are they? Kyle's eyes darted around, as if checking to make sure they weren't being watched. They're a shadowy organization, the kind of people who don't like their secrets getting out. That box? It's part of some ritual they've been guarding for decades. Supposedly, it's tied to some, I don't know, ancient curse or power or whatever. I didn't believe it at first, but when they came after me. He trailed off, his voice faltering. Wait, Jake interrupted. They came after you? Why? Kyle hesitated before pulling a small notebook from his jacket pocket. He handed it to Jake, who flipped through the pages. The notebook was filled with sketches of symbols, the same ones etched onto the box, as well as notes written in a hurried scrawl. Words like sacrifice, seal, and consequences jumped out from the pages. "I found this at the warehouse months ago," Kyle admitted. "I thought it was just some weird old journal, but then these guys showed up at my house. They threatened me, told me to stay away from the warehouse and to forget I'd ever seen the notebook. I thought they were bluffing. Until they trashed my car the next day. That's when I realized they weren't messing around." Emily's stomach churned as she listened. "So, you knew the warehouse was dangerous, and you still brought Jake into this?" Kyle's jaw tightened. "I didn't think they'd come back. I figured the box was just sitting there, forgotten. I didn't expect you two to get involved." Jake slammed the notebook shut and glared at Kyle. "You dragged us into this mess, and now they're after us too. What are we supposed to do?" Kyle's expression softened slightly. "Look, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But now that you have the box, you're on their radar. They won't stop until they get it back. The only chance you have is to get rid of it." "Get rid of it?" Emily asked incredulously. "How?" "They'll just keep coming after us." Kyle hesitated, then said, "There's a place. About an hour's drive from here. It's an old monastery in the woods. Supposedly, it's where the Wardens first started. If you leave the box there, maybe they'll take it as a sign that you're backing off. It's risky, but it might be your only shot." Emily and Jake exchanged a look, weighing their options. The idea of confronting the Wardens directly was terrifying, but leaving the box at the monastery felt like walking into a trap. Still, they didn't have many alternatives. "Fine," Jake said finally. "We'll do it. But you're coming with us." Kyle's eyes widened. "No way. I've already pushed my luck too far." Jake stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "You got us into this. You're coming with us, whether you like it or not." Kyle swallowed hard but didn't argue. "All right. But we have to be careful. If they find out we're heading to the monastery, we're screwed." The drive to the monastery was tense, the silence in the car punctuated only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the box in Jake's lap. Emily's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. The idea of confronting an ancient, secretive organization felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But the fear in Kyle's voice and the weight of the box in her hands reminded her that this was all too real. As they neared the monastery, the forest grew denser, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The road narrowed to a dirt path, and the car's headlights cast eerie shadows on the surrounding foliage. When they finally arrived, the monastery was a dark silhouette against the night sky. Its crumbling stone walls and overgrown grounds gave it an air of desolation, as if it had been forgotten by time. "This is it," Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's get this over with." The three of them stepped out of the car, their breaths visible in the chilly night air. Jake carried the box, his grip firm despite the tension in his shoulders. Emily held a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as they made their way toward the monastery's entrance. Kyle trailed behind, his eyes darting nervously. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. The faint sound of dripping water echoed through the empty halls, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the dust-covered floor. "Where do we leave it?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "The altar," Kyle replied, pointing toward a chamber at the end of the hall. "That's where it'll be safest." As they entered the chamber, the sense of unease grew stronger. The altar was a simple stone slab, its surface adorned with carvings that matched the symbols on the box. Jake placed the box on the altar, his hands lingering for a moment before stepping back. "Now what?" he asked. Before anyone could answer, a low rumble shook the room. Emily's flashlight flickered, and the air seemed to grow colder. A voice echoed from the shadows, deep and resonant, "You should not have come here." Emily's heart stopped as figures emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured by hoods. The wardens had found them. Emily's flashlight flickered as the hooded figures emerged from the shadows, their movements silent and deliberate. The wardens had arrived, their presence heavy with an almost palpable sense of menace. Jake instinctively stepped in front of Emily, gripping the altar for support as his eyes darted between the intruders. "We don't want any trouble," Jake said, his voice steady but firm. "We just want to leave the box and go." The figure at the front stepped forward, his hood casting a shadow over his face. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured, each word deliberate. "You trespassed on sacred ground. You meddled in affairs beyond your comprehension. Leaving is no longer an option." Emily's heart pounded as she clutched Jake's arm. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice trembling. The warden's leader gestured toward the box on the altar. "The artifact does not belong to you. By taking it, you have broken the seal that protects this world from what lies beyond. It must be restored, and you must pay the price for your transgression." "We didn't know," Emily cried. "We didn't mean to break anything. We just found it." Another warden stepped forward, his voice sharp and accusing. "Ignorance does not absolve guilt. The ritual must be completed, or the consequences will be catastrophic." Jake tightened his grip on Emily's arm, his mind racing. "What ritual? What are you talking about?" The leader's gaze fixed on Jake. "The artifact is a key. Its removal from the altar at the warehouse has set events into motion that cannot be undone. The only way to restore balance is through a sacrifice. One of you must stay." Emily froze, her blood turning to ice. "Stay? What does that mean?" Kyle, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "No. No way. There's got to be another way. You can't just take someone." The leader turned his hooded head toward Kyle. "You have already been marked by your actions. Perhaps it is you who should remain." "No!" Jake shouted, stepping in front of Kyle. "You're not taking him. If anyone should stay, it's me." Emily's grip tightened on Jake's arm. "No. We'll find another way. There has to be another way." The wardens began to close in, their movements deliberate and unhurried. Emily's mind raced as she scanned the room for anything that could help them. Her eyes landed on the dagger lying beside the box on the altar. Without thinking, she grabbed it and held it out in front of her, the blade trembling in her hands. "Stay back!" she shouted, her voice wavering. The leader stopped, his head tilting slightly as if in amusement. "You cannot fight what you do not understand," he said. "The artifact's power is beyond your comprehension. Put down the blade before you make things worse." But Emily's desperation overrode her fear. "If you take one of us, you'll have to go through me first," she said, her voice stronger now. For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with tension. Then, without warning, one of the wardens lunged toward her. Emily reacted instinctively, slashing the dagger in front of her. The blade connected with the warden's arm, and a strange, otherworldly hiss filled the air. The figure recoiled, clutching his arm as dark smoke began to rise from the wound. The other wardens hesitated, their movements no longer as confident. The leader's voice was sharp. "You have no idea what you've just done." Jake seized the opportunity, grabbing the box from the altar. "Let's go," he shouted, pulling Emily toward the exit. Kyle followed close behind, his face pale and drenched in sweat. They sprinted through the monastery's dark halls, the warden's footsteps echoing behind them. Emily's flashlight bounced wildly as they ran, casting erratic beams of light on the stone walls. The exit was in sight when a sudden force knocked her off her feet. She hit the ground hard, the dagger slipping from her grasp. "Emily!" Jake shouted, turning back to help her. He pulled her to her feet, but the wardens were closing in fast. Kyle grabbed the dagger from the ground and thrust it toward one of the figures, forcing him to back off. They burst out of the monastery and into the cold night air, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The car was just ahead, but the wardens were still pursuing them. Jake threw open the driver's door and started the engine as Emily and Kyle scrambled into the back seat. "Go, go, go!" Kyle yelled, slamming the door behind him. Jake floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as the wardens disappeared into the shadows behind them. The forest sped past in a blur, and for a moment, the only sound was the roar of the engine and their own labored breathing. Emily clutched the box tightly, her knuckles white. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jake glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression grim. "We find a way to end this. For good." The road stretched ahead, dark and uncertain, as the three of them drove into the unknown. The wardens were still out there, and the artifact's power remained a threat. But for the first time, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived the night, and as long as they stuck together, she believed they could survive whatever came next. The car sped through the winding forest road, the engine's roar mingling with the labored breaths of its passengers. Emily clutched the metal box in her lap, its weight both physical and psychological. She could still hear the echo of the warden leader's words in her mind. "The artifact's power is beyond your comprehension." Kyle broke the silence. "We can't keep running. They'll find us. They always do." Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. "Then we make sure they have nothing to find. We destroy the box." Emily's eyes widened. "Destroy it? You heard what they said. The box is part of some ritual. If we destroy it, who knows what might happen?" Kyle shook his head. "And if we don't destroy it? They'll keep coming after us. They won't stop until they get what they want." The car fell silent again as the trio weighed their options. Finally, Emily spoke. "There has to be a place we can go. Somewhere they can't follow." Jake glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "And where exactly would that be?" "They knew we were at the monastery before we even got there. They're always one step ahead." Emily's mind raced. She thought back to the letters they'd found in the box, to the cryptic warnings about the artifact's power. Then, she remembered something she had read, a mention of a place called the Void, the one location where the artifact's energy could be neutralized. "The Void," Emily said suddenly. "It was in the letters. It's some kind of neutral zone. If we take the box there, maybe we can stop this." Kyle's face twisted in confusion. "The Void? That sounds like something out of a bad movie. How do you even know it's real?" "We don't," Jake said, his voice steady. "But it's the only lead we have." They spent the next hour poring over the notebook and the letters, piecing together the clues that would lead them to the Void. According to the writings, it was located deep in the mountains, accessible only by a series of hidden trails. As they navigated the narrow roads leading to the area, the forest grew denser, and an eerie stillness settled around them. When they finally reached the base of the trail, the first hints of dawn were beginning to creep over the horizon. The trio gathered their belongings, Jake taking the box while Emily carried the dagger. Kyle, visibly anxious, carried a flashlight and a crowbar. The trail was steep and treacherous, the air growing colder with every step. Emily's legs ached, and her breath came in short bursts, but she pushed forward, driven by the weight of what was at stake. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a clearing. At its center was a circular stone platform, its surface etched with the same symbols that adorned the box. "This is it," Emily whispered. "The Void." Jake stepped onto the platform, placing the box in its center. As he did, the air around them seemed to shift, growing heavier. The symbols on the platform began to glow faintly, and a low hum filled the clearing. Kyle backed away, his eyes wide with fear. Is this supposed to happen?" Before anyone could answer, the hum grew louder, and a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was the warden leader, flanked by 2 others. His voice cut through the air like a blade. "You should not have come here," he said. "The void is not a sanctuary. It is a gate." Emily's heart raced. A gate to what? The leader's hooded head turned toward her. A gate to forces you cannot hope to control. By bringing the artifact here, you have ensured its activation. The balance will be destroyed, and the consequences will be catastrophic. Jake stepped forward, his fists clenched. "We're not going to let that happen." The warden leader raised a hand, and the air seemed to ripple. The other 2 wardens advanced, their movements unnaturally fluid. Emily gripped the dagger tightly, her knuckles white. "You don't understand," the leader said, his tone almost sorrowful. "The artifact is a key. It cannot be destroyed, only contained. If you leave it here, the gate will close, but the price will be steep." "What price?" Emily demanded. The leader hesitated. "A life. The void demands balance. One of you must stay." Kyle's face went pale. "Oh, hell no. There's no way I'm staying here." Jake turned to Emily, his eyes filled with determination. "Go. Take Kyle and leave." "I'll do it." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Jake said softly. "This is the only way to end this." Before Emily could protest further, Jake stepped onto the platform. The glow intensified, and the hum grew deafening. Emily reached out, but Kyle grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "We have to go," Kyle said urgently. "Now." Emily struggled against him, her screams drowned out by the noise. As they stumbled away from the platform, a blinding light engulfed the clearing. When it faded, the platform was empty, the box and Jake both gone. Weeks later, Emily sat alone on the steps of her house, staring at the horizon. The events at the void felt like a distant dream, but the ache in her heart was a constant reminder that it had been all too real. Kyle had disappeared after they returned, too haunted by what had happened to face anyone. The wardens had vanished as well, leaving no trace of their presence. But Emily knew they were still out there, watching, waiting. She clutched the dagger in her hands, the only thing she had left of that night. Jake's sacrifice had saved them, but it had also left her with questions she might never answer. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she made a silent promise: she would find a way to honor Jake's memory. And if the wardens ever came back, she would be ready.